Welcome to Lahore.
Thank you so much.
Khush Amdeed. We're delighted that you're here, and we're delighted that Indian friends are able to come to Pakistan, even though Pakistanis are not able to go to India these days. And that's very sad. We hope that the situation will be rectified. I wanted just to correct the gentleman. You are no longer books editor at Outlook. But Outlook is a very distinguished newspaper, well, a magazine. And Mr. Mehta, its late editor, was a very dear friend. Outlook has made many contributions to the life of civil society in India. So I want to begin by asking you, you're from Hyderabad originally, you were brought up there, you were schooled there, you moved to Delhi to pursue your career. Now you're as much a Delhiite as a Hyderabadi. And it will emerge in the course of this conversation that Mrs. Jinnah spent some of her happiest days in her short-lived life in Hyderabad. So I suppose it's apt. But the first question I'd like to ask you is, why were you interested in Mr. and Mrs. Jinnah?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say how happy it makes me to be in Lahore. I feel, in a way, it's a coming of home for the book. And I'm so delighted I was able to reach readers here. So I'm very happy to be here and to answer your question about why I wrote this book. I think everything I was facilitated me in writing this book. First of all, that I came from South India and therefore didn't have any baggage to do with any of these people. It was just that here was a very, very important guy who shaped our subcontinent, and I was curious about him. And especially curious because there were a spate of books that came out by politicians around then, which were like a taster. You just got a sense that here is an interesting man and we haven't plumbed his depths. So I started reading in order to find out for myself. And the more I read, the more fascinated I became with this person who was extremely complex and extremely different from the way he had been portrayed in any history book I had read so far. And I also felt that he's a character who's who's been done a disservice on both sides of the border, in the sense that he's been valorized here and he's been villainized there. So I'm very glad of the opportunity to see the human side of him.
Well, Sheela, I can thoroughly endorse that, because this, ladies and gentlemen, is an unput-downable book. I recommend it to all of you. I had to read it in haste, obviously, for this session, but I wish I had had more time. And it's interesting that you talk about the fact that you don't have any baggage, or the baggage of partition, because really it was a North Indian thing. But on the other hand, Mr. Jinnah is also, you talked about the homecoming of the book. Well, you know, ethnically, he is the founder of Pakistan, but ethnically, this wasn't really his home.
No.
He was as much a part of that milieu,
Absolutely.
Bombay,
Yes.
Calcutta, Hyderabad, Delhi, pre-partition, than he really was of this milieu.
Absolutely. So I often get this question, that, especially from Pakistani friends, why did you write a book? I mean, I see it in reviews that we don't write books on Gandhi or Nehru, but I want to say that this is a quintessentially Bombay man.
Exactly.
And
yes.
People in Bombay still love him very much. And
do they?
Oh yes, his house.
Even present-day Bombay.
Yes.
Mumbai.
Oh, they came out in hordes when the book came out. They were so interested in him, and they all came up to me after the launch was at the Taj. After that, one by one, they came to me and said, you know, I live next door to Jinnah's house. You know, my father used to know him, or something like that. He's very much an urban legend in Bombay.
Well, thank you for writing this book. And for me, whose whole life has been spent in obviously post-partition Pakistan, growing up in ideological Pakistan, this is a Mr. Jinnah that is a completely different Mr. Jinnah from the Mr. Jinnah that we've been purveyed. And, you know, he, to me, has been a distant and taciturn figure. But through your book, I see that we have a man of a lot of charm. We have a man with, surprisingly, a sense of humor. We have a man with amazing sartorial taste, and a man who was happy to be guided by his wife in changing his sartorial taste after the First World War. He was devoted, as Sheela has said, to post-World War I fashion, to the stiff collars and, you know, the kind of Edwardian gentleman attire that he was so fond of. And she persuaded him to dress more modishly. He was never sparing on the money that he spent on his clothes, but then she was able to make him more modern in his outlook. These are things that, you know, we don't know about. And another thing that comes out in this book is his romantic nature. And then on the other hand, his willful stifling of it. And in that sense, Sheela, I can't understand this marriage.
Yeah, I think that was another reason why I was so challenged by the subject, because it was such a complex marriage. I mean, here were two people who deeply loved each other, and yet they couldn't make the marriage work.
Did they deeply love each other?
Oh, I thought that comes through quite clearly in the book.
Well, yes, it does. And then, because the marriage, towards the end, you discover that he says that it's been agony for 10 years.
Yes.
And she says the same thing to Sarojini Naidu.
Yes, but they could, even after they separated, they could somehow not extricate each other, each other from the other.
Yeah, but when they got married, when they decided to get married, you know that Rati was a teenager. She was barely 18 years old. And she belonged to this very, very influential and affluent Parsi family, the Petits. Her father, Sadinshaw, was a leader of the Parsi community. Her mother was an heiress in her own right. She was brought up in the lap of luxury. And he was, Mr. Jinnah was her father's friend, 24 years her senior. And yet, she took the decision to marry him. And when they got married, what followed was ostracism and excommunication of the kind that really shakes you. And you wonder how this child was able to put up with the excommunication of her family by the Parsi community, by her own complete ostracism from her family and from the community, and then also by Bombay society, which looked down upon her, which looked down upon the way she dressed, the way she talked, the way she was, and also looked down upon this man, was very suspicious of this man. And they were very suspicious of the fact that he'd really walked away with his friend's daughter. And I mean, it's natural that she should have collapsed mentally, but she didn't for 10 years.
No, she didn't.
What do you make of that?
I feel that the Parsi community was extremely harsh with her. I think they wanted to make an example of her because they felt that the Parsi community, especially the elite, was going out of their hands. So there was a kind of a movement to punish the elite for transgressing the rules of Parsi society. And this marriage came at the right time to, she was a very, very prominent figure because she belonged to that family. So it was very easy for them to make an example of her.
On them.
Yeah.
So it was a class thing.
I feel it was a class thing because I've given many examples where, you had R.D. Tata and other people marrying foreigners, and they got away with it.
At the same time, sorry to interrupt you, right here in Lahore, Kanhaiya Lal Gauba, who belonged to an elite Hindu family, it actually went off and got married to Husna Aziz Ahmad.
Yes.
And although the parents didn't, the Aziz Ahmads agreed, And the Gauba family did not agree.
Yes.
And they ostracized them momentarily, but they accepted them back.
Yes.
In Punjab, which we see as perhaps more primitive than Bombay, something like this was accepted, and intercommunal marriage was accepted. But in Bombay society,
No,
it was condemned, and they were condemned.
In a way, it speaks of the cosmopolitanism of Lahore society.
At that time,
yes,
not anymore.
Yes, because they were able to finally be accepted and be very much part of the high society. An invitation from Husna was regarded as a big thing.
Yeah, she was
Everybody
a great
wanted-
hostess.
Yes.
But so was Rati.
Yes.
And yet she was never able to do the same that Husna had done in Lahore. She was never able to do that in Bombay, whereas you might have expected her to be able to do
They
that.
married different men.
Yeah.
So Jinnah was not the kind who liked large parties and socializing. He was very much a political man. He just wanted to discuss politics, and he wasn't interested in anything else. So she had to adapt to that. But to answer your question about how did she survive, it must have been very hard for her, because she must have been extremely traumatized, because later I read an example of another girl from the Parsi community who was excommunicated, and she went mad because of the same treatment, you know?
It's amazing, ladies and gentlemen, that what Sir Dinshaw Pettit and Lady Pettit were unable to do, Pandit Motilal Nehru and his wife did seamlessly. Their daughter, Vijay Lakshmi,
Yes.
known as Nan, had actually gone ahead and married a Muslim man. Sayyid Hussain, his name was.
That's right.
At that time. And Motilal persuaded her to dissolve the marriage and then persuaded her to marry a man of his choice. Now, these were the leaders of liberal India at the time.
That's right.
And they managed to do this, but Sir Dinshaw did not manage to do it.
I think strategically, Dinshaw Pettit was very stupid. If he wanted to stop his daughter, he did exactly the wrong things.
Yeah.
If he wanted to stop Jinnah, he did exactly the wrong things. He put up his back, he alienated him.
He even took them to court and sought
Yes.
an injunction from the court to prevent, quote unquote, Mr. Jinnah from running off with his daughter.
Yes.
And when eventually, you'll be interested to learn that when the case came to court, after they had gotten married, it was Rati who got up spontaneously and said in the court, when the judge said that the charge against you is that you have kidnapped Mr. Pettit's daughter, she got up, leapt up, and said that it is not Mr. Jinnah who has kidnapped me, I have kidnapped Mr. Jinnah.
Yes,
She
that's
actually
right.
said that.
Yes. He didn't abduct me, I abducted.
He didn't abduct me, I abducted Mr. Jinnah.
Yes, that's true.
Yes,
Yeah.
this reminds me of my own story. When I married my husband, he's 11 years my senior, again in the teeth of family opposition. And he was chided by his friends too, and they said to him, you've cradle snatched. And he said, no, I didn't cradle snatch, the cradle snatched me. So that reminds me of Rati's defense, but she was always...
That's interesting you should say that, because it came up in the assembly, in the legislative council, where Jinnah was giving a speech on the Hindu bill, and his colleagues who were opposing the bill came and made snide remarks about how he was a cradle snatcher and so on, to which he answered, you know, at 16 a girl knows her own mind.
Well, we can talk about that. But certainly at 18, she had the right to do what she wanted to do.
Yes.
Again, this is a mysterious marriage, but your story is not just about this marriage.
No.
It's about the whole scene leading up to the partition. And you can see heartbreak for all concerned on many occasions. You see a society in flux. You have these gilded lilies, these children of the privileged classes who had made good under the British Raj, who had been schooled in British colleges and schools, etc., were in a way children of the Enlightenment, but yet who were held back by convention.
That's right.
And you feel so sad and sorry because you know this trauma still goes on in our societies, and it goes on here. I'm sure it goes on in India, and I think maybe the middle classes and the upper classes may have liberated themselves from it a little bit more in India than we've done. But how? I mean, just to digress a little bit. How does it look to you now? Are intercommunal marriages much easier now?
No. It depends on which class you are from.
Yeah.
There is a growing middle class where the girls and boys want to choose their own mates, and there is a lot of resistance from the traditional societies, and there's a lot of violence against the couples, and it's very bad. I feel that the kind of space that this first generation of modern people in South Asia were making at that time in the 1900s. We have lost that space.
Yep. Yep.
Instead of it expanding.
Instead of expanding it, that space has shrunk.
Yes.
Isn't that sad? That
Yes.
syncretic space
Yes.
has shrunk.
Yes.
Which reminds me that you portray Muhammad Ali Jinnah as a man coming from a very, very traditional background, with a mother who's superstitious, who's barely literate, a father who's a sort of small businessman, etc. Growing up in a very traditional Kathiawadi background, but then somebody who, by dint of hard work and determination, just transforms himself.
That's right.
And he transforms himself into a Victorian stroke Edwardian English gentleman.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
And he is a very, very successful lawyer. He's a fabulously wealthy man by the time that he reaches his peak in Bombay. He is a representative of India's syncretic, eclectic culture. And yet, he's the architect of Pakistan and India's division on communal lines. How does that square in your mind?
I feel that this narrative that Jinnah was somehow solely responsible for the partition is flawed, because I feel that it was the political events of that particular time. At least I was dealing with up to 1930.
You do show that.
Yes.
You do show that in your book.
Yes, and I was recently reading a book by a former High Commissioner here, Raghavan, where he says there is an argument that it was the Hindu Mahasabha which created Pakistan and not Jinnah, because they were simply not willing to negotiate properly.
And we see that in the book. You see heartbreak upon heartbreak for Mr. Jinnah in the book. You see it in the way when he tries to get married to this young woman, how he's ostracized and how he's condemned. Then you see it in the failure of their marriage. Then you see it in his failure to get along with Mr. Gandhi, with Mahatma Gandhi. You see it in his failure, and you see it in the way that he loses his respect and his belief in the Westminster-style democracy that the British Raj has brought to India, because he has a great belief in their sense of justice and democracy and fair play, and he loses that as well.
Right. Yes, I think the reason I had to deal with the politics was because it was so much a fabric of the marriage, in a sense that you could not separate the politics from what was happening within the marriage. So I was forced to look at the politics. Again, I was coming with a very blank mind because I didn't know anything about, too much about the history of what had happened. So I was reading with a blank mind, and I was quite astonished actually at how much he tried in the first few years to...
And sorry to cut you and to try and make it, but don't you see this lack of generosity coming through all the way through this whole story?
Partly yes, and I always say that there were these two guys who were the giants who created the geography of the subcontinent as we know it, and that was Gandhi and Jinnah. And our tragedy was that Gandhi couldn't work with anybody who didn't trust him completely.
And Jinnah was a man who was temperamentally incapable of trusting anyone except himself. And in the process, whatever had to happen, happened. Huh?
For a man who was devoted to intercommunal harmony, I found it very interesting when you wrote about the way he dealt with Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's marriage to a Muslim. How he dealt with that, how he
Yes.
persuaded her that he may have been the prophet of intercommunal harmony on the one hand, but there was no way that a Kashmiri Pandit's daughter could marry a Muslim.
Right. He had very strong views on intercommunal marriages. He opposed them tooth and nail. He, in fact, wrote in his newspaper against it, which was what provoked that letter from Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. He was quite open that while he was deeply a Hindu, he did not believe in that kind of marriages.
You've written about his devotion to his mother, Mr. Jinnah's devotion to his mother. You've written about Mr. Jinnah's devotion to his sister. And yet, I can't help but say this. He was not the devoted husband that Reddy was looking for. He was devoted to his politics. And he was devoted to her up to a point, as she did plumb very deep wells in his feelings. But yet there was just something not there in the marriage.
I feel it was an unfortunate marriage because they were temperamentally poles apart. But I feel they could have worked out that marriage if all the circumstances weren't against them right from the start. One of it was the Parsi community expelling her so harshly from the community, which made her totally dependent emotionally on just this. That's a lot of weight to put on any marriage,
Yeah.
and especially a man like Jinnah, whose apparent and most passionate interest was politics, and then right at the time when he had this marriage and he was looking, as if he had finally risen to his stardom and his political career was more or less set on a smooth course, everything starts unraveling in the year in which he gets married. So he's forced to the wall, and he has to protect his whatever little political space he has made for himself, and that takes the energy away from the energy he needs to devote to the marriage.
And yet, Reddy Jinnah also, in her own flamboyant way, if you like, shows you glimmers of somebody who's also devoted to the freedom struggle, who's also devoted to politics. And she wants to, quote unquote, gain India back her crown of freedom. And she wants to fight side by side with her husband in this struggle. Now, if she was a very, very young person, so this could have been a passing fancy, except that for the 10 years that they were married, she did express a very sort of deep interest and did things also from time to time, until of course she was forbidden to and until she was forced to stop. But how deep do you think her own political interest was?
I think it was the deepest part of her, in the sense that I feel that's another part of the tragedy, that although her marriage didn't work, even her dreams of being a freedom leader alongside Jinnah didn't fructify. And I feel in this sense that Jinnah had an inner contradiction. On one side, he really believed that a woman's place was shoulder to shoulder, but when it actually came to the crunch, there was something of his father's personality in him, which is natural, and I found it quite intriguing that where Reddy begins her marriage by giving this very rousing speech at the beginning. Yes, and that's the last time she ever makes a public appearance, except, as a trophy wife next to him on the stage.
Because he disapproved.
We don't know that. We don't know that, but because we do know, what we do know is the reporters found it so unusual for a woman to be taking part so avidly in a political protest, that they went to Jinnah and asked him a question like, how did you allow your wife to take part in this? And he replied that, she was so enthusiastic and she was the first to raise a cheer when we were, so I didn't have the heart to stop her.
He couldn't help it.
Yeah.
But Sheila's book is also full of beautifully edged portraits, which you will really, really enjoy reading. And if I may, April 19th, 1918, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Rati Pettit are getting married. And amongst their witnesses are the Raja Sahib of Mahmudabad. And Mr. Jinnah, true to form, and the workaholic that he was, planning every detail to the T, forgets the wedding ring. And then the Raja Sahib of Mahmudabad pulls out his priceless diamond ring and gives it to the groom.
That's right.
To slip onto the bride's finger. I found that so endearing. And the ladies in the crowd will be interested to learn that Mr. Jinnah gave his wife a haq mahar of 1,001 rupees, but he also gave her a cash gift of 125,000 rupees back in 1918. Now, what would that be in today's money?
It's a fortune beyond imagining. I am not very good at maths, but I remember that it was one of the Raja's contribution to the
war fund. Yes, to the war chest. Can you imagine that? Now, that's an amazing thing. And then the other little picture that sort of stayed with me, which you etched so beautifully, is that when the Jinnahs go to Nainital for their honeymoon, they stop with the Raja Sahib of Mahmudabad in Lucknow. And she's sitting there in a vision of loveliness in her sari. And the little Raja, yani ke the Raja's son, his heir is 4 years old. This is Suleiman Mian, who's currently Raja Sahib Mahmudabad.
No, his father.
Oh, that was his father?
Yes.
Amir Muhammad Khan, of course. And he sat in Ratti's lap and wouldn't get off it.
That's right.
And then when he recorded his memoirs, he said that her fragrance stayed with him. And that was the one thing he couldn't forget.
That's right.
So
he also remembers the little gifts she always gave him whenever he met her.
So, here's this very, very beautiful young woman, and she's beautifully dressed, always immaculately dressed. And I suppose, the fashion for those deep-necked, deep-backed, sleeveless blouses that were worn with chiffon saris later by all the Maharanis and all the glitterati of India, I think that fashion began in Bombay at that time.
I think she could have been the pioneer of that.
She could have been the pioneer of that. I wanted to ask you that.
Yes, because there's a letter from Sarojini Naidu which mentions that there is a Spanish Rani. I think she was married to the Raja of
Maharaja
Patiala.
Kapurthala.
Yes, and she says that she borrowed Rati's clothes and jewelry
How
for
she
the
could have
photo
got into
shoot.
Rati's clothes is beyond me, because the Spanish Rani was rather sort of well endowed and Rati was slim, etc. But I wanted to ask you, Sheela, there is in your book obviously also mention of that very historic moment when Lady
Wellington.
Lady Wellington, no, not was it Lady Wellington?
Yes.
Lady Wellington, yes. Who commented on Mrs. Jinnah's dress, and she thought it was inappropriate. She thought that the blouse was too scant. And she turned to the ADC at dinner when the Jinnahs were sitting at table, and Lady Wellington said in her iciest voice to the ADC, "Get Mrs. Jinnah a wrap in case she's feeling cold." And Mr. Jinnah turned around in defense of his wife, got up from the dining table and said, "Mrs. Jinnah will get herself a wrap if she's cold. Thank you very much," and never went back to the governor's
That's
house
right. Yes,
after that.
that's the story.
So that is not just legend, it's really happened.
Yes. That's what we hear from contemporaries. They give the story.
She was also routinely sort of ostracized or criticized for the way that she dressed.
I feel that she did have a mischievous streak in her, and especially when she went for very conservative meetings like the Muslim League meetings, she would make a point of dressing as she always did, and it was not I mean, there were lots of young people who were beginning to dress like that. I came across some letter from Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who's exactly her age, saying that, you know, these frumpy blouses that these people wear are so ugly.
Especially the Parsi ladies wore.
Yes, yes. So all the young people were wearing stuff like that. So, but you know, most women, if they are a little more weak-minded, will dress according to the occasion because they don't want to raise eyebrows. It was something that was not there in Rati. It would be something she'd want to do just to
Shock. As she
yes,
said
yes.
once, she wanted to
Shake
shock the
people up.
complacent Parsi community
yes.
out of its complacency, and she wanted to shake them up.
Yes.
And I think she managed to do that with the Muslim League as well.
Yes,
And
yes.
Mr. Jinnah must have found that very difficult.
Although he kept the stiff upper lip and never spoke about it.
That's right, that's right. It's what a coincidence it is that Dina Jinnah, their only child, was born on the 14th of August in 1919. It amazes me that neither parent appeared to have any interest in the baby for a long, long time. How do you explain that? I mean, sorry to cut you here, but Mrs. Jinnah was devoted to her dogs, especially to her lapdog Arlette.
Yes, she was very tender.
She was very tender with weak people. She was very tender with little ones. All her life, you see that through your book. And yet, the minute the child is born, she's sort of left to nurses, left to governesses.
She never once mentioned the child.
She never talks about the child. The child is not even given a name.
Yes, that's right.
I don't understand how that happened.
This was a part of her that was the most difficult for me to unravel. So I left it as it was. The only thing is that, you know, it was a generation where they outsourced their motherhood mostly, if they could afford it, to nannies. But in a society like that she was eliciting comment from her closest friends was something, that means she was carrying it too far. So, and I always wondered what it was coming from. I had some theories, and one of it was that she was resentful of her maternity, and because she keeps talking of these shackles she wants to break. And what can be a bigger shackle than being a mother of an infant? So
When you're a child yourself?
yes, but recently after the book was released, I did go to Hyderabad, where, as you said, she had gone for a visit. And a lady in the audience came up to me and said that her mother had written an unpublished memoir in which she mentions Rati's visit to Hyderabad. And the interesting thing is, Rati went out with this lady to a Hakim seeking some kind of contraception.
So she didn't want to have
She
children.
didn't want to have children.
I see. Well, Sarojini Naidu, who, again, a fascinating piece of history, is the Jinnah's closest friend, and she is very well-meaning. She thinks the world of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. They come from completely different backgrounds. She's a Bengali, married to a Madrasi. He is a Kathiawadi, then a Bombay wala. And yet she has the highest respect for him.
Yes.
She never once doubts the Jinnah's marriage as
No.
anything other than well-intentioned. She's supportive of them throughout their lives together and separately.
Yes.
And Rati has her most sort of, what shall I say, intimate motherly relationship with Sarojini Naidu after
That's right.
after she departs after her mother kicks her out of her life.
Yes.
Sarojini Naidu, in her own letters to her daughters, is very angry with Rati for the way she treats her daughter.
That's right. Yeah. Although, Sarojini Naidu also was feeling the shackles of being a housewife, and had in fact left her marriage and her responsibilities at home to play a greater part in
But she had a house husband, Dr. Naidu,
Yes.
who basically looked after the home and the children
Correct,
and everything.
correct.
And yet, in her letters, Sarojini has a very tender, close relationship with Padmaja and her other daughter.
Yes, she does.
Rati has no mention at all of Dina. Dina's not given a name.
No.
The child gave herself a name.
Yes.
Yes.
Uh.
Amazing. I think 8, 7 or 8?
Yes, 8. Well, when her mother died, she went.
A year before Rati died, she separated from Jinnah. So her mother came back into her life, and at that time,
She took over her grandchild.
she took over the grandchild. Till then, they were not on speaking terms.
And Mr. Jinnah did not see the separation coming in
No,
1928.
it was a surprise.
It was a surprise to him. That's again an amazing thing. What explains Sarojini Naidu's devotion to the Jinnahs?
They were very close. She was a good friend of both of them. She was a very simpatico person. And she was also the congressperson in charge of Hindu-Muslim affairs.
That's what brought them
And she admired Jinnah intensely. And in fact, it was Jinnah who was a little dismissive of her, calling her just a poet and not a real politician and so on, which she took in good part. But she really relied on him and tried to cajole him and coax him into, forming some kind of unity with the Congress.
Sheela, thank you very much for this. It's in a way, it's obviously a fascinating book, but it's a very, very sad book also. It's a sad book because here you have two individuals who are seeking love and companionship and who don't find it, even when they have the opportunity. And finally, you have Rati on the 20th of February 1929, the date of her 29th birthday, taking an overdose of sleeping pills and committing suicide. What a waste of a beautiful, beautiful life, and what a waste of I think, a good mind that wanted to be part of the freedom struggle.
That's right. That's the big tragedy of what happened.
Did you ever have the opportunity to meet Dina Wadia, their daughter?
No, but she was very against, through a kind friend who's in the audience just now, who may not want to be named. I did get to speak to her, and I asked permission, can I do an interview with you, because I'm writing this book. She refused, but I think she must have been quite lonely, and she was quite close to my friend. So she kept the conversation going. She didn't want to put down the phone. She was in New York at that time. So I did a very sneaky thing. I kept passing questions on index cards for my friend to ask her, and the phone was on. So that's how I know that she named herself and how close she was to her grandmother, and how much she loved her, and other things she said.
This was obviously after her visit to Pakistan.
Oh yes.
And did she say anything about her visit to Pakistan?
No, I wasn't asking her about that, but I was asking her about the Naidus. She didn't remember them at all. She was too young for to have much memories of that early time.
She didn't say anything about her father.
I actually forgot to ask her about her father, because I really wanted to know more about
the mother.
Her relationship with her mother. I asked her one thing about her father. I said, what happened to the letters that, there must have been a lot of letters your mother wrote to your father. And she said that there was a lot of stuff. She was a poet, and she used to keep all kinds of things. And my father had all those things. So she said a very strange thing. She said, maybe Fatima destroyed it.
That's another aspect in this book that you will find fascinating, the relationship between the brother and the sister.
That's right.
And you'll find also Rati's resentment of that relationship.
Yeah.
And this is the Nand sister-in-law kind of, the sister-in-law, sister-in-law kind of relation, Nand-Bhabi relationship that still goes on in our societies. But Mr. Jinnah was very accommodating. He sent his sister away so that his wife could be peaceful at home, etc. But I would really recommend that you spend time over this book, because it gives you a vision of a Mr. Jinnah that we don't know in this country. And it gives you an idea of how lonely was his struggle to stay inside a federated unit, how difficult was his struggle to stay in the marriage that he had chosen for himself, how difficult it was for him to stay at the top of Bombay society after everything that had been said and written about him as well.
That's true.
And then how difficult it was for him to make the choice that he eventually did, which was for Pakistan.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Sheela Reddy.
Thank you.